A banker once held more power than kings. His signature, not a throne, not an army, not a parliament, could decide whether a nation went to war or stayed at peace. Industrial giants bent to his terms. Politicians sought his approval before making national budgets. And yet, the most astonishing twist was this: he never held elected office. He rarely appeared in public, and most citizens didn't even know his name. This wasn't a monarch or a tycoon. This was the governor of a central bank, an unelected figure whose decisions quietly shaped the fate of millions. The secret history of central banks isn't a tale of dusty ledgers and interest rates. It's a story of hidden influence, political battles, calculated power, and the institutions that ultimately decide what money is and who gets to control it. To understand how central banks became the unseen engines of the global economy, we have to step back to a time when money wasn't managed by economists, but by monarchs with unpredictable desires. In the 1600s, European rulers treated national treasuries like personal vaults. When debts piled up, they simply demanded more gold, seized private wealth, or debased the currency by mixing cheaper metals into coins. Confidence collapsed as often as wars erupted. Financial chaos wasn't a glitch in the system, it was the system. Amid this instability rose a new idea. What if money could be managed by an institution separate from the shifting moods of kings? What if governments relied not on treasure chests, but on credit? And what if that credit could be centralized, controlled, and expanded when needed? The first major experiment began in 1694, when England, desperate to fund war against France, accepted a bold proposal. A group of wealthy merchants offered the crown a massive loan. In exchange, they wanted a charter to create a bank. The Bank of England authorized to issue banknotes backed by government debt. It was the beginning of a paradox: a private institution with public power. A bank created by investors to support the state, yet ultimately gaining influence over the state itself. This early central bank didn't hide its ambitions. It became the government's banker, its lender of last resort, and the arbiter of national finance. Interest rates were no longer dictated by rulers. They were shaped by the new institution's policies. And as Britain expanded into a global empire, the Bank of England became the financial engine behind it. But this wasn't stability, it was leverage. The bank depended on the government, and the government depended on the bank. One could not survive without the other. That interdependence became the template for every major central bank to come. Across the Atlantic, the United States struggled to replicate this model. Its financial history reads like a list of experiments gone wrong. The first Bank of the United States was created in 1791, opposed by many who feared centralized power. It succeeded, then fell to political conflict. A second bank replaced it, stabilized the economy, and then was destroyed by President Andrew Jackson, who accused it of corruption and tyranny. Without a central bank, America suffered repeated bank runs, collapses, crashes that ruined ordinary citizens overnight. By 1907, the U.S. financial system was so unstable that a single man, J.P. Morgan, personally organized a bailout to stop a nationwide collapse. A private banker had to rescue the country. That embarrassment forced lawmakers to create the Federal Reserve in 1913. But here is the twist. The Fed wasn't entirely public or entirely private. It was a hybrid regional banks owned by private institutions, overseen by a government-appointed board, but operating independently from political control. Power split across layers so no single group could dominate, at least in theory. As the 20th century unfolded, central banks transformed from lenders of last resort into something much bigger. Wars demanded financing, depressions demanded intervention, nations demanded stability, and central banks, once cautious institutions expanded their influence. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system tied global currencies to the US dollar, which was backed by gold. The Federal Reserve suddenly had global importance. The European economies, rebuilding from devastation, relied heavily on their central banks to manage scarcity, foreign aid, and reconstruction. The Bank of Japan shaped the post-war miracle that turned Japan into an industrial powerhouse. Central banks were no longer hidden in back rooms, they were becoming the architects of national destiny. But power brings limits, and limits bring breaking points. The first major breaking point came in 1971. The US could no longer maintain the gold backing of the dollar. President Nixon ended convertibility, effectively untying the global financial system from any physical anchor. currencies floated, inflation exploded. Central banks gained an unprecedented new role, controlling the value of money itself. From then on, the world watched central bankers like celebrities. Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve Chairman, raised interest rates so aggressively to tame inflation that mortgages soared, factories closed, and unemployment skyrocketed. It was brutal. It was controversial, but it worked. The era of high inflation ended, and Volcker became a financial legend. In the decades that followed, central bankers became the new high priests of the global economy. Alan Greenspan was considered a genius, capable of extending prosperity indefinitely. European nations created the European Central Bank, giving it control over a currency shared by dozens of countries. Japan embarked on massive interventions to fight deflation. China's central bank became the quiet orchestrator of the country's dramatic rise. And everywhere, political leaders increasingly relied on central banks to solve problems they couldn't solve or wouldn't confront. Yet behind the prestige, something darker unfolded. Central banks gained extraordinary power, but also extraordinary responsibility. When economies faltered, people blamed them. When inequality grew, critics pointed to their policies. When crises erupted, central banks became the lifeline and the scapegoat. The 2008 financial crisis marked the next turning point. Global markets collapsed, banks failed, and entire economies froze. Central banks stepped in with unprecedented force. They slashed interest rates to near zero. They printed trillions of dollars, euros, pounds, and yen through a policy known as quantitative easing. They rescued institutions that were supposedly too big to fail. They took actions once considered extreme, even unthinkable. And here lies the quiet twist. Those emergency measures never fully ended. For more than a decade, central banks kept interest rates low and expanded their balance sheets. Asset prices soared, debt levels exploded, governments became reliant on cheap money. Investors assumed central banks would always step in when trouble appeared, but that assumption became dangerous when inflation returned. Suddenly, the same institutions that rescued the world now had to tighten policy, raising rates rapidly, and the consequences rippled across every economy. Mortgage rates doubled. Governments struggled with higher debt costs. Banks faced liquidity stress. And the public began to ask a question long avoided. Who really controls these banks, and who holds them accountable? The answer is not simple, because central banks were designed to be insulated from direct political pressure. Independence is meant to protect the money from politicians seeking short-term gains, but independence is not the same as neutrality. Central banks respond to governments, to markets, to international institutions, to crises, to political environments, and to public expectations. Their decisions shape everything from unemployment to housing costs to currency stability, yet they operate with a level of autonomy that no other public body enjoys. And beneath this structure lie unresolved tensions. One tension is between public interest and market stability. When central banks act to prevent crises, they often protect financial institutions that contributed to those crises. This creates moral hazard, encouraging risky behavior, because rescue seems assured. Another tension is between transparency and influence. Central banks publish reports, hold press conferences, and explain their decisions. But the complexity of those decisions makes genuine public oversight nearly impossible. A handful of economists and policymakers make choices affecting trillions of dollars, and most citizens can only watch. A third tension lies in democratic legitimacy. Central banks affect elections, economic cycles, and national prosperity. But their leaders are not elected. They are appointed, insulated, and designed to operate above politics even, though their actions shape politics directly. These tensions lead to a question at the heart of modern economic debates. Do central banks serve governments, markets, or the public? Historically, the answer has shifted, depending on the era. In their early days, central banks served the states that chartered them. In the 20th century, they served national economic stability. In the 21st century, they increasingly serve global financial markets because the interconnected world demands it. Their decisions ripple instantly through currencies, stocks, commodities, and international capital flows. Modern parallels show how delicate this balance has become. During the pandemic, central banks injected liquidity at record speed, preventing a depression, but the resulting surge in money supply contributed to the highest inflation in decades. When they reversed course, raising rates, economies slowed sharply. Governments blamed central banks for inflation. Central banks blamed governments for overspending. Each blamed global supply shocks. The truth sat in the mix, a fragile system dependent on coordinated action, yet often pulled apart by conflicting priorities. In emerging markets, central banks fight different battles. Turkey's central bank faced interference from political leaders who demanded rate cuts despite soaring inflation. Argentina cycles through crises, printing money to fund deficits while its central bank struggles against a collapsing currency. Lebanon's central bank oversaw a system that eventually imploded into one of the worst financial collapses in history. The patterns repeat: political pressure, hidden vulnerabilities, delayed reforms, and the unavoidable consequences of mismanaged monetary power. And still, central banks stand at the center, trying to stabilize systems that often resist stability. The secret history of central banks is not a conspiracy of shadowy rulers pulling strings. It's a history of institutions built to solve one problem, then given the responsibility to solve many more. A history of power expanding because crises demanded it, and then never shrinking back. A history of nations relying on central banks not as referees, but as firefighters, architects, and medics all at once. And with each crisis, their influence grows, and so does the uncertainty about where that influence ends. 3 takeaways stand out. First, central banks were created to protect money from political instability. But over time, they became the managers of entire economies. That shift gave them immense power that is difficult to oversee, replace, or restrain once granted. Second, financial systems depend on trust, and central banks are the ultimate custodians of that trust. When confidence in them falters, whether through inflation, policy mistakes, or political conflicts, the consequences spread through every layer of society. Third, crises expand central bank authority faster than democracies can debate it. Each emergency sets a new precedent, and every precedent becomes the new normal. This cycle pushes central banks into roles never envisioned by their founders, with risks no institution can fully control. The real question is not whether central banks are too powerful, but whether modern societies rely on them too heavily. When economies become dependent on intervention, resilience weakens. When governments use central banks as shields, accountability fades. And when the public loses faith in the value of money, even the strongest central bank struggles to restore stability. If this deep dive gave you a clearer picture of the hidden influence shaping modern finance, consider subscribing for more long-form breakdowns. And stay curious, because the story of who controls money is still unfolding. And the next chapter may be the most important one yet.